Dear brothers and sisters, may the peace of Christ be with you. Today, I like to reflect with you about the encounter that Jesus had with the scribes and the Pharisees. If you look at what we've been doing in these first two chapters of the Gospel according to St. Mark, you may have noticed that Jesus is presented to us as demonstrating his authority to uplift, not to oppress, but to uplift. Today we see that the scribes and the Pharisees confronted Jesus once again. This is the third confrontation, the third one. They confronted Jesus by asking him, why is it that your disciples are breaking the law? They are plucking, they are walking, they are reaping on the Sabbath. And Jesus defended his disciples by giving them a story, giving the Pharisees and the scribes the story of what David did in the first book of Samuel, chapter 21, from verse 1 to 6. How David, when he was hungry and his companions were hungry, got into the temple and ate the bread that was meant only for the priest to eat, the bread of presence, the showbread. We remember that Abiathar, as mentioned by Mark, which there's a little confusion here because Abiathar is the son of Ahimelech. Many scholars believe, if you read first book of Samuel, chapter 21, many scholars believe that it was actually Ahimelech who David met. But don't worry yourself about that. The fact is that Matthew and Luke told this same story, but they did not mention the name of the priest. Now, Jesus draws a conclusion from that because David is a very important figure for every typical Jew. And he was using that story to remind them that human need ranks higher than any law. By law, David and his companions were not supposed to eat that bread because David was a king, not a priest. But because they were hungry, they ate that bread, and it was not considered as breaking the law because the human need supersedes every legal provision. The only thing that the priest asked David is about the moral condition of his companions, and David vouched for them because the priest said to David, I hope that your companions did not have anything to do with women recently. If they had something to do with women, they were not qualified to eat that bread. That was the only condition. But ordinarily, that bread, the showbread, was supposed to be eaten only by the priests. Dear brothers and sisters, so in this encounter between Jesus and the scribes and Pharisees, we see that Jesus defended once again his disciples. Jesus is always here to defend you, to defend me, especially when it comes to our human needs. God even respects our human needs, and that's why he gave us life, because he knows that we need life. So, dear brothers and sisters, I'd like us to take this one by one. I've given already the summary of this encounter, but the first thing I like us to reflect on today is what I call courage to dialogue. Those who confronted Jesus for the third time today, they did not have the courage to speak directly to Jesus because they believed that as the master of the disciples, the mistakes of the disciples is also the mistake of Jesus. So they were looking for a way to trap Jesus. They were looking for a way to discredit Jesus. They were looking for a way to make nonsense of Jesus. And they found an opening because of what they considered as mistake of the disciples. Sometimes we have problems with people. We are not really, courageous enough to ask them for dialogue. We're not courageous enough to engage them in meaningful discussion. We try to go around. We try to go indirectly to attack them. This question about the disciples eating on the Sabbath is a way that the scribes and the Pharisees wanted to discredit Jesus, but they went through the indirect way by attacking his disciples. So if you have got a problem with your wife or with your husband, or with your neighbor, or with your children, or with your parents, be courageous enough to engage them in a dialogue. Don't go around trying to transfer aggression or trying to go indirectly. No. Meaningful communication will always bring about a better relationship. The second thing is about being a fault finder. These people were hungry, for God's sake, and these other guys were busy finding fault. So what was the fault? They broke the law according to the scribes and the Pharisees. And remember, this is just, the oral law, not the written law. Because we know that the scribes, in order to explain the Ten Commandments, they multiply the Ten Commandments into 613 laws. So the what the disciples did today is not part of the Ten Commandments, rather is part of the human laws. And Jesus will be accused of breaking these same laws when he's going to heal someone on the Sabbath. So these guys were there finding fault because they believed that the disciples were working, and to work on a Sabbath was, a forbidden act. Now, the Bible says that to work is, is an act of breaking the law on the Sabbath. But the Bible did not say clearly, okay? The Bible did not say clearly what constitutes work. The Bible did not say exactly that. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 5 from verse 12 to 15, the Bible clearly says that work is not allowed on the Sabbath, and plucking is work. Now, what's different between the plucking, the reaping, and whatever the disciples were doing? The difference is this, that what they did cannot be considered strictly as work because they were not using sickle. The Jewish law in Deuteronomy chapter 23 from verse 25 allows someone who is hungry to, pluck something from another person's farm. Is allowed, insofar as you don't use sickle, because to use sickle means you want to harvest much in order to sell them. But if you are hungry, Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 25 allows you to pluck from another person's, farm. So what the disciples did cannot strictly be considered working because they were not using sickle and they were not plucking, they were not gathering so much in order to go and sell. If you look closely to some quotations, which I'm going to mention now, you understand that the Bible speaks about work, yet the Bible did not specify exactly what this work constitutes. If you look at Exodus chapter 16, verse 22 to 30, if you look at chapter 34 from verse 21, if you look at chapter 35 from verse 2 to 3, Numbers chapter 15 from verse 32 to 36, the prophecy of Nehemiah chapter 10 from verse 31, then chapter 13 from verse 15 to 22. If you look at Jeremiah chapter 17 from verse 21 up to 22, you will see that the Bible speaks about work, but not mentioning exactly in particulars what constitutes work. Now, the disciples were accused of working, but remember that even the scribes and the Pharisees believed that work is permissible on the Sabbath if that work is done to sustain life. You see, they were contradicting themselves when they accused the disciples of working. The disciples were plucking the grains because they were hungry. They needed to sustain their lives. But the fact is that when you have hatred for someone, whatever the person does is always wrong. They did not think about the implications of the accusations towards the disciples of Christ. So, dear brothers and sisters, if you don't like someone, try to be objective about the person. The accusation, the confrontation of these Pharisees and scribes was never objective. It was an attack, as I said, indirectly on Jesus. So summarily, Jesus wants us to retrieve once again the spirit behind the law the Ten Commandments that God gave to humanity. It is about LOVE. It's about us taking care of the needs of other people. You see, the human welfare, the human well being, the human needs is considered as higher than any other thing, than any kind of legal provisions or whatever. I gave an example this morning in the Mass. I asked the people, Sunday Mass is obligatory, right? You are on your way coming for Sunday Mass. There's only one Mass in the whole of this country. And you met someone who was involved in an accident. Are you supposed to take care of the needs of that person, or are you supposed to come for the Holy Mass, which is obligatory? Of course, the human need is always higher than any religious or secular law. And that's what Jesus wants us to understand, that the human person is most precious than any legalism or any law, either divine or human law. That human need is the most important. And for me, dear brothers and sisters, God Himself even respects the law of love your neighbor. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. You see, this is what we are called to do, to love one another, to care for the needs of one another, to show that human side of us, especially to those who are suffering. There are many of us who hunger for different things. Some hunger for love, some hunger for shelter, some hunger for food, some hunger for justice, some hunger for employment. There are so many kinds of hunger. But remember that Jesus took His disciples through that grain field was not by accident. He knew they were hungry, even though they didn't tell Him, but He knew they were hungry. He knew there was a field of grain around there, and that's why He took them through that way. Nothing happens in God by accident or coincidence. But remember, the human person ranks higher than anything, and we must always make sure that we uphold the welfare of the people around us. As Jesus will say, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And of course, the Son of Man is greater and higher than any Sabbath. And that Son of Man is love. Let us ask the Lord today, dear brothers and sisters, that we may always appreciate the people around us, take care of them, take care of their needs as much as we can. God bless you.